Hey y'all, it's Mary Hyatt, life coach, business consultant, Kundalini yoga, meditation and breathwork teacher, certified conversational hypnotherapist, and top leader with doTERRA essential oils. Welcome to season 3 of the Living Fully Alive podcast. Now we're doing things a little differently this time. This season is an 8-part mini-series called Feel to Heal. And we will be taking a deep dive into all things feelings and emotions. How we respond to what we feel inside ourselves impacts our work, our relationships, our health, our spiritual lives, and everything in between. And when we don't have the skills to properly feel and process our emotions, our repressed anger, shame, resentment, fear, grief, and loneliness ends up driving the bus and hijacking our lives. But I want to show you a better way towards emotional resilience, freedom, and healing. Rest assured, I am still here to guide you on the path of inner transformation and empower you to come back into alignment with your soul, trust your inner voice, and design a life that makes your heart sing. So, let's jump into it. Hey everyone, it is Mary Hyatt, and I am sitting here with the fabulous Lindsley Brooks. Hey girl, how's it going?
Hello, good. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Long time no see.
I know.
Gosh.
Miss you.
I know. Well, for those of you that are avid listeners to the podcast, you will recognize Lindsley from season 2. She was my part-time co-host. And as I was thinking about our 8-part series here for Feel to Heal, I was like, okay, I've got to have at least like one episode with Lindsley.
That's
and so we
right.
can actually dish it out, have our casual, candid conversation. So just as a little background, Lindsley's like my best friend. I mean, we are sisters. We grew up in the same town, even though we met in our adult life. So we have a lot of similar experiences of what it's like to be women raised in the South and now being very independent, kind of branching out of the norms of our kind of little Southern society.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a soul sister. And I'm excited to have this conversation because so far we've been talking about, okay, what are emotions? What does it look like to actually feel something in order to find regulation, to find recovery from trauma or stressful situations that inevitably happen in life? But we haven't slowed down to talk about, okay, what does it look like when you're dealing with other people who are emotionally immature, emotionally dysregulated, emotionally, what's the opposite of intelligence? I don't want to say dumb, but
well, where they are not maybe even conscious around how their emotions are affecting other people as well as not even themselves, right?
Yeah, that's a very sweet way of saying it. Thank you. Exactly. I think that's perfect. Who are unaware of their effect. And if you're listening to this episode in real time, we just came through the holiday season, and a lot of us, thank God we're able to be with, well, maybe not, thank God, we're with family, or with people that we're close to in our lives. I do know that, a lot of people spent the holidays alone, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think this concept of maybe some dysfunction inside of family units and family of origin is fresh on our minds. And maybe we're still in recovery.
A lot of triggers. Yeah, a lot of triggers.
A lot of triggers. Yeah. We probably need to go to a drink and talk about our own triggers over the holidays. Yeah. So I think it's kind of actually perfect timing to talk about this. And, Lindsley, you and I, before we hit the record button, we're just talking about the types of emotional dysregulation that happens for people. And I think one of the things that I've noticed, certainly in my own life, growing up in the South, and I think this may be true broader than the South, that's just my reference point, but even maybe just as a woman, I learned very early on to take cues, emotional cues from other people in my life. So my parents, obviously, the church that I went to, teachers, friends, and let that begin to dictate like how I responded. So like if somebody was unhappy, if it felt like walking on eggshells, if somebody was upset, I would like shapeshift. And I think kind of the common term we would use for that now is like people pleaser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Like I became really, really great at making sure that I was pleasing everybody around me. And part of how I knew how to please was noticing in the people around me, like what wasn't, regulated, like somebody's emotions, if they had certain body language or certain facial expressions or moods or mood swings or those types of things. I started to be able to really read the people around me, sense energy, that just almost like unspoken feeling of like, ooh, this is not a good time, or they're upset. And I would come in and I would make people smile. I would bring in some ease. I would people please. I would do whatever I thought they needed me to do to keep peace, to please. So I'm curious if is that a Southern thing, do you think, or is that a female thing, or is that
I think it's a human thing. And I think, to me, it's kind of like how we all survived our childhoods, right? It's kind of like we learned what gave us positive reinforcement, and we kept doing that on a very subconscious level because on some way it's a survival technique. You know what I mean? And so on some version, we all kind of did whatever we needed to get our needs met by a parent, to get attention, to get validation, to get love. And it is so unconscious that there's no shame or judgment around it. But what ends up happening is, I think, and kind of to what you're saying, is that it ends up being this thing where as an adult, it gets in the way. And then we're still doing those same kind of survival techniques, the people pleaser for you or whatever. It actually is like, oh my gosh, I'm still doing this thing that actually helped me survive my childhood. But now as an adult, it's getting in the way of me being able to emotionally regulate, to know who I am, to know what is healthy, to know how to stop attracting a certain person that I keep wanting to please, those kinds of things. Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And what comes to mind is this like emotional blueprint that happens early on in life based on attachment, how our caregivers were to us, if having emotions was safe or not, whether our primary caregivers were in themselves, like not emotionally intelligent, like if we had abusive parents or parents that had the eruption of emotions, or just or simply
emotionally dependent parents. The ones that actually, they got all their emotional needs met through you. So you ended up having to carry on their emotions too. It's endless, right? Like it's
so many dysfunctional patterns that become a blueprint of how to get love and how to avoid pain. And I think that at the baseline, all of us have these emotional blueprints that we get set up with that aren't even really, like you said, our truest selves. And I think part of this is understanding the dysfunction that we have in relationships with other people where we're trying to get our needs met. I think it's like a really normal human survival thing to want to be accepted, to want to be loved, to want to be important or special, or if on the bare minimum, not be abused, right? To avoid that pain. And so we learn how to tap dance. We learn how to shapeshift in order to make sure that we stay safe. And so I want to dive into what you said about that those patterns are still present, like in adulthood. Like we don't outgrow these unless we slow down and really do a lot of work. They become unconscious. They become a blueprint that we build the foundation of our lives upon, that we don't even know that. Like we weren't conscious when they were created. We didn't have a say-so of like, oh, window goes here and the foundation slopes this way. Like it was a byproduct of our environment.
Well,
and I think
sorry, go. I was just going to say, like, that aspect of what you're saying is huge, because it's not that we even are aware of them until all of a sudden our lives stop working. Right? Like as children, it actually was the thing that helped us survive, to get those needs met, like you just said. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, why isn't this same way of being actually working in my life? And it usually takes some sort of catalytic moment. You said doing the work. And yet think about how most people don't just like easily sign up to do the work. And that's what you do for people so well, is like introducing them to a different way of living and being. And it's almost like it usually hits us kind of hitting a wall, that like, oh my gosh, my relationships aren't working, or I keep running into the same pattern. What's going on? Oh, there's some part of myself I have to look at. And it usually takes some sort of catalytic event, divorce, breakups, health, whatever. And so it's so funny. It's like, oh my gosh, well, how do I actually learn something new when the very thing that helped me survive to get my needs met is getting now in the way? And then how do I know how to be in a healthy emotional dynamic with another person? So there's the work of being an adult, an emotional, healthy adult.
Truly. And I mean, like I always say with my clients, I say, this is not sexy work. You know, counter to what Instagram and online coaches will make it look like, you know, follow these 5 steps and just do this program and everything will be fixed. Like the real work is not sexy. And yet incredibly worth it and so rewarding. And I just keep thinking like this oftentimes shows up, if not, well, I would say not always, but very often it shows up in our relationships with other people. So romantic relationships, familial relationships, even just patterns that we notice inside of ourselves with our friends. Like I know that for me, for the longest time, before I was able to dive deeper into this work, I attracted people into my life that were very needy, that were very codependent. I was codependent with them, that were usually the addict, erratic type personality. And I would come in and swoop in and save the day. And so I learned early on to be a rescuer, to be like the unhealthy side of the Enneagram 2, which is what I am, the helper. And so I would develop these relationships. And like I said, it became a pattern of very codependent type relationships. And this wasn't just romantically. This flooded into friendships, working relationships inside of my business, where I had this need to make sure that I held somebody's life together for them. And they were allowed to be erratic. They were allowed to be dramatic. They were allowed to be dysfunctional, and I would pick up the pieces. And so those relationships over time, I started to see like, oh my gosh, this is a pattern. And it wasn't their fault necessarily. You know what I'm saying? Like it wasn't something that I needed to fix them. It was about me being the match for that type of person. I know you can identify with this because we've talked about it a lot.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear like what that looked like or looks like for you, like just the kind of aspect of relationships mirroring your, where you're at emotionally.
Well, and I think that you alluded to the Enneagram, and you know how, like, I'm sure your listeners know what fans we are to that, because it's been a real wonderful mirror to help me see what role I had as a child to actually try to get needs met. And so for yours, you were the helper. Maybe another kind of psychological term would be an enabler or a people pleaser or whatever. And for me, I was like, you know, I'm a 7. And so I'm the enthusiast. That means I'm also the cheerleader. Let me kind of fan the flame of you and get you all excited and lift your spirits up and put all of my enthusiasm in another person to literally almost kind of avoid taking responsibility, not consciously, but because it was so much easier for me to make it about somebody else and more of a, let me kind of keep your enthusiasm and your energy up. And I definitely see that, like, you know, in friendships, relationships, whatever, it's kind of like a lot of times my codependency, because I think on some level, I don't want to say this, maybe people don't resonate, but I think the relationship there's a thin line between not being codependent and codependent. You know what I'm saying? It's right. Most people are going to be dependent and interdependent in a relationship, but is it an open dynamic, or is there a closed circuit codependency, dysfunctional, toxic dynamic? That's kind of what we're talking about.
Right.
And I think on some level, we've all had a version of an unhealthy dynamic when it comes to relationships. And for me, the way it would show up is that I would literally I could lose my own sense of self and my own like, oh, wow, right, I do have a career and preferences and likes and dislikes. Let me just make it all about what's going on for you, so that I could somehow or another hope that it would come back around and eventually get my needs met. Right. And that's been the work I've been doing. And I know you have too, in your own way. Like we both, it's like every healthy relationships. I honestly say you can do all the spiritual therapy, whatever, but if you can't do relationships well, and I'm not saying perfect, but if you can't do relationships well, then what's the point of all this work? Right. It's like, you could be the biggest guru on the mountaintop or a preacher or a spiritual, whatever. If your relationships aren't working and you've got dysfunction everywhere when it comes to your interpersonal relationships, that's a red flag.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's an invitation to me of things that need attention, because when our relationships are not safe, to me, that's like a huge red flag when they mirror the instability that maybe we experienced as children. And you think about the addiction to drama that a lot of us have or have had, needing there to be conflict, needing there to be strife, needing there to be some sort of, what do they call it? Like batting of heads or that battling. Conflict. It's like, to me, in a safe environment, I remember my therapist saying once to me, she was like, when you find the person that is really like a healthy person for you to be with, a secure attachment, it's going to feel a little bit boring. And I was like, dang, I don't like that. Does not feel good. Because I was used to like, those highs and lows. I was gonna say highs and lows, lots of sparks, like let's have that twin flame energy. And I even in friendships, not even so much in romantic relationships. Well, I should say not exclusive to romantic relationships, but I started to go, wait a second, there's something here that's asking for attention that's unresolved inside of me, that's making me create a situation that is codependent. Like one of the things that you mentioned was, okay, making sure that kind of everybody else was taken care of and not focusing in on yourself, not noticing your own needs, not really attending to you. And I keep thinking of the misconception that I think so many of us have had growing up is that you're in charge of somebody else's emotions. You're responsible for somebody else's emotional state. It's your job to keep the peace or to make somebody happy or to make sure that person never gets sad. Kind of like you were talking about the 7, like, let's keep energy up. Let's not ever get sad or get depressed or get lonely or experience grief. And so we take on this false sense of responsibility, I think sometimes, that we're supposed to manage and be the keeper of other people's emotions, which is, that is codependency, right? It's like, oof, rough.
And what's interesting is when you said that, I think to myself, so what? And I'm like, okay, why do we do that to ourselves? And I really think the reason is because it's not so much that we don't want somebody else to feel uncomfortable. It's actually that we don't like how we feel while we're watching. You see what I'm saying? There's some aspect of like learning how to sit in our discomfort. Instead of you going in and trying to rescue someone that you love, or me trying to, psych somebody up and inspire them, it's almost like that's what I think healthy relationships are, is knowing where I end and someone else begins, knowing, what I have control over and what I don't. And as we all know from the recovery world, any other people, places, or things are not within my control. And so really, really getting and accepting that. And then, okay, now I've got to know that if somebody else's behavior is bothering me or triggering me, it's like, I've got to learn how to sit in the discomfort of not either trying to change them, rescuing them, right? It's kind of like, and that's our work, is learning new tools so that we can actually regulate our emotions so that we can sit in whatever it is that we're trying to distract ourselves from feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
And that really, if it's like up until now, we've been going in to rescue someone or to save somebody, actually to avoid feeling a feeling within ourselves that you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that it's like, oh my gosh, that puts everything in perspective. Because if all of a sudden I realize that I can't save this person or rescue them, that means that I now have to sit with myself and look at what I've been running from.
Well, and it makes you like the risk of being abandoned is so high at that point. Like it's so vulnerable. If you've created a construct in your life where it's like, okay, as long as I do these things, people stay. Mm-hmm. As long as I become what they want me to become or keep the peace or whatever, then I'm not left. Even in the dysfunction of fighting or, and not that fighting is always dysfunctional, there's a place for healthy conflict, but when it becomes unhealthy and becomes rage and becomes blaming and there's not working towards a resolution, even in that, there's some sense of backwards thinking around, I just need to stay safe. Like as long as I keep myself protected from whatever it is that is my biggest fear, whether that is pain, whether that is, like oftentimes in abusive relationships, having to go out and be on your own. I mean, there's so much fear for that, of having to start over and try again or to do the work. I mean, I think that by nature as humans, we want to avoid pain on any level. And so I think you're so right. Like the things that we do to kind of sort of keep it all together, even if it's dysfunctional, they work to a certain degree. And yet there's obviously like there's so many more options that can create deeper health. But I just think about like, even at the beginning of some of this work, like one of the things that people will do at the beginning of working in a therapeutic setting or recovery or whatever is learning how to draw boundaries. And that feeling of potentially disappointing somebody or the potential of somebody being angry with you or the potential of somebody not being happy with you and hanging in that discomfort. Ooh, I mean, that's a skill you have to practice and have to get more comfortable with and learn over time, but it's uncomfortable. Like you said, it is not an enjoyable experience to sit in your stuff, the fear of disappointment, feeling like you might get abandoned, all of that. I mean, again, we do whatever we can to avoid those moments. And so I think there's an invitation for deeper compassion for ourselves of like, we always have a really good reason for doing what we do. Always. Like, even if it's dysfunctional, we have a really great reason unconsciously why we've set it up that way, why we behave that way, why we react the ways that we do. And it is to keep ourselves safe.
Well, and I think what you said, I want to go back to it is like, even if it's dysfunctional, it's the known. And sometimes the unknown is scarier. And with the known, even if it's dysfunctional, there's a expectations around it. There's a familiarity around it. It's like, we can manage that. We at least know what that looks like. But if you were to actually take the risk, like you mentioned, all of a sudden you're sitting in so much unknown. And to me, that's where the fear kicks in, and it becomes so uncomfortable that the risk to remain the same, it's kind of that Anais Nin quote. It's like, literally, sometimes it gets to that place where if you don't take a risk, it's more painful. And that's when you're like, I just can't live like this anymore. And then the other times it's like, it's too scary. I'm going to have to figure out, and to use your abandonment word, you're going to have to figure out how to essentially self-abandon. Because when you're in that place, it's like, okay, I'm going to have to figure out how to compartmentalize my needs, my emotions, whatever it is, in order to stay in this situation. It is not healthy, but I'm too afraid to do anything about it. The risk is too great. So what do? The only way you can survive in that moment is to start self-abandoning.
Right. You shut down. You leave the self. And this is why, like, I love this conversation, because obviously you and I have been in those places more than once, a lot. And I love this work that we're talking about and becoming more aware, having mindfulness practices and tools that can assist us in learning how to trust ourselves again, learning how to come back to ourselves again. Like you said, having preferences, having an opinion, learning how to have a voice again, even just like learning how to express emotions. Like, I know for a lot of my clients, and this is true for me too, like I went so emotionally numb for survival for so long that I didn't know what it felt like to express anger in a way that felt safe. I didn't, or that wouldn't have risked abandonment. I didn't know how to experience joy, like true, like pleasure, true joy. I had no reference point for that. It was just flatlined.
Mm-hmm.
It was truly emotionally numb. And so I think that the invitation to this work is, number one, there are tools that we can use that actually help us regulate, that help us come back to ourselves, and that help us feel in a way that does feel safe again, that helps us to go, okay, I can learn how to communicate with my person better. I can learn how to do conflict better. I can learn how to voice my needs and share my desires or whatever that is. And it's a skill set that is to be practiced over time, to unlearn what we've learned for so long. But I want to talk to you about some of the stereotypical kind of red flags in how we could relate to other people and other people's like emotional control that they may have on us. Because I think it's helpful, like when we're in these patterns, we don't even know sometimes it's happening, and we sort of given our power away. We've sort of really have left ourselves, and we're letting somebody else dictate our emotional states. And so in order to get our power back, I think we need to recognize like, oh, this is unjust, or this is not right, or this is a power dynamic that I don't like and doesn't feel good anymore. So I want you to talk a little bit about gaslighting, because that's like a buzzword. That's a term that I think a lot of people throw around that is really appropriate for this conversation. So will you talk to me a little bit about how you experienced gaslighting, like, and how you get out of that pattern of being the one that's being gaslit?
Hey there, real quick. If you are at all feeling extra overwhelmed or exhausted by social media, or simply don't have energy to read through any more emails, believe me, I get it. That's why I want to invite you to connect with me over text. I send out weekly affirmations, words of encouragement, meditations, and of course, you'll be the first to know about any upcoming events or when I publish a new podcast episode. Plus, it's really me, so it's super easy. Just text 615-930-3522 or go to maryhyatt.com/text. maryhyatt.com/text. All right, back to our podcast episode.
Well, so it's so fun because the term itself, just to even say, like, where did this word gaslight come from? It actually came from a film in the 1940s. I don't know if you knew that. It's a movie. And the whole premise of the movie was that a man was literally trying to convince his wife that she was insane, and he would flick the lights on and off and like over and over again. And she started to like go insane. And the whole premise of the movie was that he was trying to get her to go into an insane asylum so he could steal her inheritance. That's where the actual term came from.
I had no idea.
I know. And so we use this term now to actually talk about, when you're trying to distort someone else's reality. That's when that kind of the phrase comes about, and it can show up in all sorts of ways. And so I'll just be really candid and say, my experience of some of that was when I was previously married, and I was in a dynamic that was very codependent, and I didn't like how much my ex-husband drank. Okay. So whether we call him an alcoholic or not, that's not my place. I didn't like how much he drank. Now that right there, for me to even say that out loud and to actually say, I don't like how much you're drinking, that actually was a risk, because every time I would say that, he would tell me he didn't drink too much. And in his mind, he didn't. Right. And so it became this trying to convince me, and me trying to convince myself that his drinking wasn't a problem, and that it wasn't bothering me. And so just the idea that like, the reality here is that there is a dysfunction, there's a dynamic, there's a pattern, right? Yeah. There's noticing that something I'm not in reality there, like there's some aspect of kind of like, what do you do in order to keep some level of a sanity? And that's a lot of times why people disassociate or detach or check out. Right. And so for me, like the gaslighting aspect was like, literally trying to be convinced that like his drinking wasn't a problem,
Yeah.
when reality was showing me a lot of different evidence for that. Okay.
Yep.
And I was constantly trying to fix myself through therapy, through books, through being girl. I can't even tell you how many times I read that book, The Power of a Praying Wife, just so that I could become more submissive, because I literally believed, okay, he obviously is telling me he doesn't have a drinking problem and he doesn't seem to be affecting, but like, and so I've got to change me. It must be me.
Yeah.
And so all I did was try to fix myself so that I could be sweeter, more loving, more accepting of his behavior. Yeah. And at the end of the day, after doing a lot of codependency work and recovery work, what I realized is it's okay. It is okay to have a preference that I don't want to be married to someone that drinks a lot.
Yeah.
Or drinks excessively or whatever. Like it,
right.
It's okay. Like it's okay that he wants to drink a lot.
Yeah.
But it's also okay that I don't want to be married to somebody like that. And therein lies the separate. I remember literally looking at him and saying, you can drink as much as you want. That is okay. That is your prerogative. It's just it's not good for me.
Yeah. Wow.
It doesn't actually help me be my best self to be so consumed about what you're drinking or not drinking or doing or not doing. Like it literally. And so when I got unplugged from, I don't think he wasn't intentionally gaslighting me, but that's how gaslighting comes through, is that it's a form of trying to maintain control or to manipulate to get what you want. And you end up having to engage another person. And oftentimes you try to distort what is real through a haze of illusion, addiction, lies, so that you can get what you want.
Yeah. Well, and again, so that person, like in his case, so that he stayed safe, right? Like if we go back to, we all want safety. And obviously that's very dysfunctional, where you're at the point where you are distorting reality. And on the flip side, you start feeling like you're crazy. It's like, I've been in that same situation, not with the drinking, but a different type of addiction. And you're like, I'm literally seeing the evidence like play out, and you're to my face telling me that this is not true. And it's like, here's the proof, but there's a weird thing that happens in the brain of the enabler that you start going, well, gosh, like, well, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm not seeing a reality. Maybe it's me. And the blame turns back to the self. And then that's another really challenging thing. And you end up breaking trust with your intuition. Like you stop being able to count on your gut instincts, that inner knowing, like that feeling like I know something's going on, or I know this is happening, and it violates all of that, And so that's a huge cost to me, is it gets to the point where you can't trust your feelings. So that's another reason to go numb, is because you're going, okay, literally everything inside of my body is screaming and telling me that this is truth. This person is telling me the opposite. And so what do I do with that? And so usually until we have done some work and there's a breaking point and we, kind of like wake back up, we have to disassociate from our bodies, disconnect from our emotions, turn off our inner knowing and our intuition. And we have to rebuild that. I mean, it takes time to rebuild that.
Well, okay. So I'm going to go here. Okay. I hope your listeners are ready, but listen, it can actually be yes, you can have a gaslighting dynamic in a very interpersonal relationship. You can also have it in like within your, like a societal gaslighting. So if you think about that, it's like, okay, let's keep using my example with my ex-husband. It's like, okay, well, my friends might say, well, we've never really seen him drunk, Lindsley, or his, his family or whatever. And then the next thing, is maybe even society starts telling me that drinking is no big deal, and that like, maybe it's not. And then there's advertisement everywhere. And then, it's cool to drink, Lindsley. So actually it really is you that has the problem, Lindsley. And then you're like, okay, well, I don't want to lose now not only my husband, but maybe my social people. And now I don't want to not be able to go out with him in society. So I guess it really is me. So maybe I'll just try to be okay with something and accept something that is not acceptable for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we're seeing this even on a huge collective level right now. It's like, you know, a lot of smoke and mirrors can happen, and like church dynamics, spiritual dynamics, government dynamics. I think we're seeing it across the board right now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I hope that wasn't too much to say.
No, I'm really glad you shared that, because it becomes a mind, you know, FUCK a lot of times where you're like, okay, again, I feel this thing. I have this inner knowing, and yet everything on the outside is trying to convince me and manipulate me into something else. And what's going on? And I think that, you know, we have to get back to our sense of sovereignty, our sense of agency, our sense of, I know what's right inside of me. And this brings me to kind of another term that is often thrown out, although I used it with a client the other day and it was kind of blew her mind. Like she'd never heard it. I thought, I got to talk about this on the podcast, which is spiritual bypassing.
Yes.
Because like you were saying, you know, inside of religious organizations, oftentimes this happens, but even on just a, not even like within an actual church or synagogue or whatever, mosque. I mean, spiritual bypassing happens to all of us. So talk to me about that a little bit, because I think this is really, again, makes us disconnect from what's real inside of our emotions in such a huge way. So let's start with the basics. What is it?
Well, first of all, spiritual bypassing, I think it is more like pertinent now than probably ever before, because we have so many people who are wanting to do this kind of work, right? Like they're wanting to maybe do some childhood stuff, or they're, you know, getting into meditation or whatever else. And then all of a sudden we start finding spiritual reasons for things. And it actually, like, you know, it's like, well, you know, I need to be more peaceful and loving and accepting towards my my husband, or I should be okay if my husband wants to have another partner, but I'm not okay with that. And I'm being extreme in my examples, because it really can just be as simple as like, my neighbor's dog is irritating me and I'm sitting over here trying to meditate and I'm trying to bypass a negative emotion.
Yes.
Instead of addressing or taking responsibility for how I'm feeling or what's coming up for me, I circumvent that and go around it by literally bypassing a natural human emotion by over spiritualizing things.
Yeah. And this is like, to me, so much of like positive psychology and oftentimes mindset work. It's like, just change your thought, just make it more positive, make it sound better. And it's like, wait a second, let's address what is causing the discomfort. Let's address the grief or the wound or the trigger or whatever it is that's coming up. Cause that to me is where real healing happens, is when we get to exist inside of our humanness and the rainbow of all of the emotions, and the fact that we are going to get triggered, the fact that none of us are 100% healed and never get agitated or angry or whatever. It's like, wait a second, where is there space for compassion, non-judgmental compassion towards ourselves, of like, let me attend to the need that is showing up inside of me in the form of anger, loneliness, anxiety, depression, fear, stress. Like, how can I lean into that versus being like, it's fine, so-and-so has it much worse than me, I'll be okay.
Or let me just pray about it, or let me just give it to God. And you know, we're not by any means minimizing the beautiful work that can happen with surrender. But there is an aspect of like kind of a recognition to I think grief. I think we do a lot of that spiritual bypassing with grief.
Totally. Well, we're so uncomfortable with grief as a society. I was watching Queer Eye for the Straight Guy last night, the new season that came out on Netflix. And there was an episode with all these teenage kids, and they did an episode where they gave these kids in Austin, Texas, like low income level students, a prom, this like night to remember. And it was because they had been doing virtual school and they didn't get to have a normal senior year. And these were kids that were like from immigrant families who were working several jobs while going to school on Zoom. And so they wanted to have like one in-person outdoor event for their prom. And so, the Queer Eye guys came and did this whole big thing. And, but they were all sharing their experience of the past 2 years of the pandemic. And I mean, when I tell you, I was bawling at that episode, because I was like, their level of grief over the things that they had lost, what they thought was going to be their life. And it turns out it wasn't. Like, they didn't get to have what they thought they saw in movies and TV shows about their senior year. They never got that. And I just wept, not only for them, but also for my own grief. And I feel like we are really having to come to grips with grief in a way that we never have as a whole. Obviously there's death, since the beginning of time, but that's often done in really close circles. It's sort of private. You certainly wouldn't talk about that on social media. You wouldn't openly share that, even like with other people, except maybe the person living in your home. And so I think that now, like, we're sort of being forced to admit that people grieve and grieve longer than we think it maybe should take, it's not going to be, okay, the funeral's done, or okay, now we can get outside and we don't have to wear masks or whatever. It's like, it doesn't end when situations change, it lingers. And so I think that honesty and just like admittance of we're human and we have these emotions and it's okay. That doesn't make us weak or bad or not spiritual.
Or good people, or make us good. Because I think what you're saying, like it's a denial aspect to any negative emotion. And then with like the work you do, you're teaching people that if you try to detach or compartmentalize or in denial about the real emotion that you're trying to cover through spiritual bypassing, through any kind of bypassing, then it actually will catch up with you, because we're not made to live compartmentalized or detached. It's like, or fragmented, like, like the truth around health and wellness is wholeness. Right. And so that's how we will be. I mean, evolution and how I think the human psyche and have a emotional intelligence is all about bringing all these fragmented pieces together and literally creating the wholeness aspect. And so it will catch up with you. And sometimes it usually takes, like where we started, a catalytic event through your body, through broken relationships, through financial ruin, whatever, in order for it to kind of have to face yourself, and that's when free will comes in. It's like, okay, you're going to keep running and compartmentalizing and trying to bypass, or are you really going to finally look at yourself with loving compassion and really do the work about integration with your, that loving and accepting all parts of yourself,
And I think that's like a kind of a cool place to sort of like wrap this episode up, is this idea of this work. Oftentimes I think why we avoid it is because we think, number one, we're going to feel a lot of like self-blame and shame and judgment towards ourselves, because that's typically how we operate, right? We have these conditions upon, you're not supposed to feel these certain things. You're not supposed to have anger or have whatever. And so to admit that we're human, there's a part of that obviously we want to avoid, because we've made it mean something, that we're going to be weak or bad or sinful or whatever. And so I think that what I've recognized in doing this work with myself and also with my clients is that, like, actually the real way towards healing is like so gentle and compassionate and slow and tender and forgiving, like self-forgiveness. It's like we create a safe space to hold ourselves and to say, like, I hear you. I see you. It's okay. You matter. Your emotions matter. That is sad. That is scary. That's not right. Whatever it is, to validate ourselves and our experience. And I think that this work ends up being, like, to your point, so loving, as opposed to more judgment. Like, I think that sometimes that keeps us from the work, is thinking somebody's going to like slap me on the wrist and say, you're a bad person for having all these emotions and you need to fix yourself and figure it out. And it actually is, I think, when you work with the right person, like, like, to me, I was kind of the biggest surprise was like, oh wait, actually this is just a walk into more love.
Yeah.
Like this is learning how to allow in more love and acceptance for myself, not more judgment and shame. It's more love. And that's not bypassing. It's like, oh no, that's the balm. That is the salve. That's the healing piece of it.
You're turning in towards yourself as opposed to self-abandoning.
Yeah.
Right. In order to, like, because we stay stuck doing these patterns in those inner relationships, and we keep abandoning ourselves, which actually I think is what creates the suffering and the pain more.
Yeah.
And so, like what you're saying is, it's a shift from going like self-abandoning and actually choosing and believing and doing the self-love work. And then really that requires you to trust the process that you're on, and to trust and have faith that even though it's an unknown territory, that it actually will take you where you want to go and create less suffering and more joy than if you keep doing the same patterns of self-abandoning and codependency and gaslighting, bypassing all of that.
Totally. Yeah. Because that really is like, once you get out of it and look back, at least for me, I'm like, that was so miserable. Like I was so miserable. I can look at my body. I can look at my mindset. I can look at the way I live my life. And it was so much suffering, unconscious suffering. And I didn't feel like I knew how to shift it. And now to be here, it feels so liberating. Like I have agency over my emotions. I'm able to recover well from stressful situations or trauma or, whatever. It's like, I have tools now that help me walk through life in an empowering way. And I've regained that power back, in my relationships, certainly in my relationship to myself, with the world. I mean, it's so worth it. I mean, so worth it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this was a little lighthearted conversation about emotional dysfunction
for a New Year topic. Yeah.
For a New Year. Oh, well,
so good.
Thank you.
Yes.
I love chatting with you.
Always, anytime. And especially these kind of conversations, because doing healthy relationship, I think it's the number one priority, I would think, for anybody who wants to do health, wholeness, and wellness. It's just not enough people having those conversations. So,
I mean, truly. And I think that the hope is that when we look into our own stuff, it not only heals our own experience of life, but it really changes those that we come into contact with. It builds our empathy towards other people. It allows us to create healthy, secure attachments with others, to know how to do conflict well. And gosh, we need that more than ever right now. Yes. So the message from today's episode is do your work.
Yes.
Do your work and go to recovery.
Yes. Amen.
Girl, thank you. Thank you. I loved hanging with you.
Always. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey there. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it to your Instagram stories and tag me at Mary G. Hyatt. Or, of course, share it with a dear friend, sister, or colleague. I think we could all use a little more emotional awareness, don't you think? Plus, if you haven't already subscribed to the Living Fully Alive podcast, make sure to do that now so you don't miss out on any of my episodes or guided meditations. All right. Thanks, y'all, and see you next time.